The Aquifer Flight Ready 360 is a universal water solution. It doesn't matter what the water conditions are at your destination. In fact, you don't have to know what the water conditions are. The reality is, we never know until we get there.
Storm hitting the Bahamas, one of the strongest Atlantic hurricanes.
If it's freshwater, that's not a problem. This will work fine without any adjustments in freshwater. If it's contaminated freshwater, the system will operate perfectly to create drinking water. If it's brackish or seawater, it doesn't matter. This is a universal system that works in any water condition. So you can operate it on 12 volt, on 24 volt, on 120 volt AC, and 240 volt AC. Any power source is an acceptable power source for this unit. If there are no outside power sources, you can still run your system on the built-in solar power plant. With regard to site selection, there's a couple of things we want to look for. First is water condition. We want to choose the best possible conditions in terms of the clarity of the water. We're trying to avoid any kind of oil skim. If we see an oil skim on the surface, we keep looking until we find a better location. We're also looking for a footprint that can accommodate us. So we need room for our solar panels. We need room for the water maker casers. We need room for our operators to operate, and we also want to consider room and a way to erect a shade over the operators to prevent sun injuries. Today our water point is a marina location. Aquifer operators love marinas as a water point, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we have clean, clear access to the water from a pier or a dock. Two is that we have a clean, dry, flat place to operate. And three is that we can scan the water from above here to see any kind of incoming oil film or skim that would cause a problem with our intakes. Beaches are another choice, but beaches are not ideal for aquifer operators. The reason for that is that beaches tend to have a lot of sand suspended in the water, and that sand can be a problem with our intake pumps. There's also the tide. As the system is deployed and the tide changes, we may need to move the entire system with the tide. Aquifer operators are always looking out for our membranes. We want to make sure that the water that goes through those membranes is the best possible water we can get. One thing we should consider is that our membranes don't like chlorine. So our operators are always trying to protect the membranes from any kind of chlorine exposure. If fresh water from a municipal system is your only water source, that will still work, but we'll use a carbon filter to remove the chlorine before it goes through the system.
Okay, so pre-deployment, we actually would always recommend that you run the water maker before you deploy with it if you have the opportunity. It's just better to do it in a controlled environment so you know once you arrive on site that you've got everything ready to go and there's no guesswork. If you can't do that, at the very least, what you want to do is charge the battery. So the system comes with an AC cable, so you just basically plug this into any AC outlet, which I just happen to have right here. Internally here, you want to flip the battery on, so the circuit breaker needs to come on, the solar charge controller will light up. You turn the indicator to the second position, which says AC input charging battery, and you're good to go. You can leave that plugged in indefinitely. And the charge controller will just manage the batteries and keep them at a full charge. And that's really a good thing to do before you deploy, so at least when you arrive on site, you've got batteries that are fully charged.
So just a quick overview of what it looks like when the aquifer is set up and running. We have our 3 solar panels. We're tilted towards the sun to maximize our PV potential. We have our spares kit here, which has our pumps. It has our flotation for the pumps. It has the water bags here that we use for flushing, for pickling, and for cleaning the membrane. We have our solar kit. You can see our 2 lithium-ion batteries here. You can see our solar controller, which is controlling charge from the solar panels to the batteries. And you see our power selector switch. This will allow us to select any power that's available to us to operate the system. Next is the water maker itself. A quick overview of the water maker includes the Clark pump, There's two membranes here. These are seawater reverse osmosis membranes. The Clark pump is a pressure amplifier. So it's taking the pressure that comes from the intake pumps and it's essentially amplifying it up to the osmotic pressure, about 800 pounds PSI to 1,000 pounds PSI, depending on the water conditions. The Clark pump doesn't use an external power source, it's just the pressure that's coming from the intake pumps. One thing we look for in the aquifer is the heartbeat of the Clark pump. You can see it, and you can hear it, and you can feel it. And this is a good indicator of normal operation of the system. If you put your hand on the Clark pump, you can feel that it cycles back and forth every few seconds. And that's what we're looking for normal operation, is the heartbeat.
So one of the things we'd like to go over is just what you should expect to see while you're operating the system. These systems this isn't actually running right now, but we have a little clip of showing the gauge panel while it's running. And what you'll find is that the feed pressure that goes into the system from the submersible pumps will vary as the Clark pump, which is the energy recovery device in the system, cycles back and forth. That's totally normal. That's just the way the pump works. So cycling pressure up and down is a very normal condition. The pressure will cycle about every 5 to 10 seconds, depending on water conditions and water temperature. So as the temperature of the water increases and the salinity drops, the pressure will also drop. As the water temperature decreases and the salinity increases, the pressure will increase. And that's totally normal. That's just the way it works. And that's based on how much pressure is required to drive water through the membrane and make fresh water. So the pressure fluctuates normally on a cycle, and also the product flow will fluctuate on that same cycle. So you'll see the product ball dropping up and down as the system cycles. What you're looking for to just understand normal operation for both of these gauges, both the pressure gauge and the flow gauge, is you want to see where it's at its highest. So what's the top pressure that you see, and what's the top flow rate that you see coming out of the product flow gauge. And those are the indicators of how the system is performing. For example, when you're looking at the pressure coming into the system, if you see the pressure starting to drop from what's normal, given where you're installed, that would probably mean that the bag filter on the feed pump needs to be cleaned. Because as that bag filter gets restricted with debris, it'll restrict the flow going into the pump, and that'll reduce the feed pressure. So as we look at the system cycling, it's totally normal, nothing to be concerned about. That's just the way the unit runs.
The Aquifer Flight Ready solar kit comes with 3 solar panels. All 3 are 144 watt panels. On a mostly sunny day, that's going to be plenty of PV power to operate your system. The batteries will get you through some of the clouds that you'll get on a typical day. And in a heavy cloud day, you may need to switch over to a generator or an alternative power source to keep operation through the day.
So another key advantage to the Spectra Watermakers Aquifer line and the system design is that the system uses very little power to actually make water from seawater. We're able to provide a portable solar power unit that will operate the system typically for the whole solar day. It's very efficient. It actually will charge the batteries while the water maker's running on a bright sunny day. It allows you to deploy the unit with no fossil fuels required.
Removing the need for fossil fuels to operate your system is a key advantage. Many times when we're first in at a disaster site, there is no fuel, or the fuel has been contaminated. Our solar operation removes that constraint. You can show up at the site without any fuel whatsoever.
Let's talk a little bit about the solar power box. So what we have here is the power supply for the water maker. There's an AC power supply that's connected to any 100 to 240 volt AC power supply, single phase. It can handle 50 or 60 hertz. So you can plug this into the wall, into a generator, whatever you have available. We can also power the system with solar panels, and then there's a solar charge controller that manages either the power coming from the AC power supply or from the solar panels. This switch box here controls the functions and how all these components work together. So the first step in this process is you turn the battery on. This is a circuit breaker that basically protects everything from overcurrent, and it's also the on-off switch. So what you see here on the solar charge controller is this top line is showing the power coming in. Right now nothing's hooked up, we're not charging anything, but we'll show that in just a minute. The middle one is showing the battery condition. So you can see there's a little bar graph on the right hand side here that shows that the battery is about a third charged. So that's showing 26.8 volts. Normally fully charged it would be just a little over 28 volts. And then the bottom line showing the current going out to the pumps. If we were running the pumps right now, that would show amperage being drawn by the pumps. So if we want to turn this on to charge from the AC power source, we've got the AC power supply plugged in. So if we put the selector switch to AC input charging, that's going to start charging the battery. So you can see there's 10 amps going into the battery right now, and you can see the battery voltage increasing as the battery charges. And again, we're not drawing any power, so there's nothing showing on the bottom. If we were hooking up solar panels, or we had the solar panels hooked up, we would just switch this over to solar charging, and then that would allow the solar panels to charge the batteries. If we're only going to run the system on the battery, it's not going to charge. You can see from the controller, there's no charging happening. All we're doing is using battery, but again, we're not drawing any current because we don't have any pumps hooked up. There's also an option of using direct 12 volt external input. So you want to turn the battery off if you're doing that, because none of that's going through the charge controller. And then you can hook up jumper cables to these contacts over here. So the 12 volt one is clearly labeled. That's this contact, and this is the ground. So you just hook normal automotive jumper cables up to this, and you can run the unit off of a car battery. Or if you have a 24 volt power source available, same thing. You just use the negative goes to here, the positive goes to there, and you have 24 volts that can power the water maker now.
The Aquifer Flight Ready 360 is a flight ready solution. That means that it can be carried as luggage on a commercial airline flight. That allows our operators to be the very, very first to arrive after a disaster. The steps you need to take to prepare for a flight are only to turn the battery to the off position. You don't need to discharge the battery or remove the battery before your flight.
So we've talked a little bit about how the power supply works. There's also a little cheat sheet included with the unit that will show you the different settings so that you can see that in this case everything's off, nothing's charging. Here's how you run it with the water maker running, but it's not charging, it's just on the battery. And it just goes through the different settings that you can have, and also explains again what the indicators are on the solar charge controller. So this is really handy to have in case somebody gets confused and it's not working the way you expect it to. Just refer back to this and you should be good to go.
So this is one of our submersible intake pumps. Submersible means that it's in the water and it's pushing water up to the water maker. The other option there is to have the water intake pump installed in the case, in which case it would be vacuuming or pulling water up. The advantage to pushing the water up to the water maker is that you never have a problem with prime. So the first two lines of defense in an aquifer filtration system are one, the 100 micron filter bag, and two, the 50 micron filter screen. We have two different ways to configure our intake pumps to draw the best possible water. So if you have skim on the surface of the water, it could be oil skim, it could be organic, it could be algae, What we would want to do is position the intake pump farther down in the water to get to better quality water. So in this case, where we want the pump to sink, we removed the float. On the other hand, if you have good clean surface water, then you would want to position your pump just a few inches below the water, say 12, maybe 14 inches down. This, with the float configured on the intake pump, will establish a float where it's exactly about 12 inches down. So assessing the water conditions here, we have good light on the water and we're seeing no oil skim at all. So we know that if we're on the surface here that we're probably going to be okay and probably drawing the best water possible. Okay, so in this case we're going to drop this with the float. In seawater reverse osmosis, the pressure in the system will vary according to the temperature and the salinity of the source water. It's typical to need to adjust your system for those pressures. In the case of the aquifer, there are no adjustments to be made. Our operators do not need to learn to monitor pressures and adjust them. The system will do that automatically.
So just to talk a little bit about the pressure relief valve on the Clark pump. So there's just a big round knob in here. It's about 1 inch in diameter. Normally you want that closed all the way so that the system will build pressure. The times you want it open are if there are ever any chemicals present in the system. If you leave the pressure relief valve closed and any chemicals are introduced into the system, you can damage the membrane. So it's just something to avoid at all costs. So times to leave the pressure relief valve open are when you're flushing the system. If you are working with a water maker where you didn't run it yesterday and you don't know what condition it was left in, I would always assume that there's chemicals present, so just run it for 20 minutes with the pressure relief valve open to flush anything that might be in the system out, and then you can close the pressure relief valve and make water. Another reason to leave the pressure relief valve open while you're starting the system up is it makes it really easy for all the pumps to prime, water to go through the whole system, and then as soon as you can see discharge coming out of the brine discharge, go ahead and close the pressure relief valve and the system will start building pressure and make water.
When we're working with freshwater, there can be a temptation to use the reject water for other purposes. Maybe it's sanitation, maybe it's flushing toilets, maybe it's taking a shower. We are always very careful about that at the water point. It's very easy for reject water to be confused with drinking water, and we need to take steps to prevent that from happening.
So I want to talk a little bit about the salinity monitor that comes with the unit. So there's a salinity monitor that has actually 2 probes. They're labeled in and out. So you basically turn the unit on. There's a little red button you push that'll activate the monitor. Depending on which one of the probes is hooked up, you just push one of either the in or the out button. That'll show on the display the total dissolved solids in the product water, or the salinity of the product water. Anything under 1,000 ppm is potable. The water tastes a lot better under 500, but anything under 1,000 is totally drinkable. That's based on WHO standards.
When your pre-filter indicator turns red, it's time to replace the pre-filter. First step is to turn off the power and release the pressure. Release the pressure. So the filter housing can be a little hard to remove. We've supplied you with a lever to help release the filter. So what you want to do is use your case as a bench and surge into it to release the filter housing. When we replace the pre-filter, you can set it aside, you can clean it, you can let it dry, and it might be reusable. When we're putting the filter back in, we're looking for a perfect seat. So here we have an improper seat on the pre-filter. And there you have a pre-filter that's properly seated and ready to be installed. So end of the day operations require either a freshwater flush or a pickle. The Aquifer comes with a foldable waterproof bag that serves as a bucket. At the end of the day, we've taken time to fill the bag with about 5 gallons of water, which we'll use for a freshwater flush. This is going to flush out any of the biologicals and organics that are on the surface of the membrane. It's going to flush them out of the system, and then we're going to cycle fresh water through the system. So with the pump running, we're going to invert the pump. The intake is on the bottom. We drop it into the freshwater bag. We're drawing fresh water through the pump now and rejecting it out the eject line. So at this point, I've drawn about 2.5 gallons of the water through the system, flushing the membrane and rejecting the water. Next, I'm going to recycle the fresh water back into the water bag and allow the membrane to cycle through that fresh water to clean the membrane. At the end of the day and at the end of the deployment, we want to take steps to preserve the battery. So at the end of operations, you're just going to flip the switch to turn the battery to the off position.
So we want to be sure at the end of the deployment and before you put the unit into storage that you fully charge the batteries. So you can do that by simply plugging them into the wall and watching the display on the solar control as we talked about before, and just making sure the battery is fully charged. Then just flip the switch on the battery so that the display goes dark on the solar control and you can store the unit. So along with the readiness protocol around charging the batteries before you deploy, it's always a good idea to drill with the system with the groups that you're going to deploy at least once every 6 months. And that does two things. It kind of refreshes everybody's memory as to how to use the system. And it's just good for the water maker to flush it, repickle it, make sure everything runs, check that there's no leaks, confirm that the batteries are fully charged and ready to deploy. And again, you can just plug the AC power supply into any 110 volt power source. You can actually leave it in storage with that plugged in. As long as you've got the battery on, you've got the selector switch set to AC charging, and you can see that the battery is charging or it's already fully charged based on what's on the charge control display. So we're going to show you how to pickle a system. The only thing that's different from how you would do it in the field is that we're using a plastic bucket instead of one of the blue bags that comes with the pump. It's just a little bit easier to demonstrate. So the first thing you want to do is the hoses that come out of the water maker for the brine discharge and the feed water in, just have those going into a bucket. Then you've got your submersible pump. So we're going to connect the submersible pump to the inlet hose to the water maker. So you've done this, you've seen this before. Okay, so that's the water connection to the water maker. Connect the power. You can actually connect the power directly to power supply. You don't have to go through the splitter that's in the water maker. It's the same power going out, but that just makes it a little easier. Then you want to put the pump in the bucket. You want it upside down so the screen's in the bottom. You also want to, maybe look at restraining the hose, because when the water starts flowing, it's going to want to push this hose out of the bucket. So once you've done that, everything's set up. Your bucket's full of fresh water. Take a packet of SC1, dump it in the bucket. If you just let it sit for about 45 minutes to an hour, all of this will dissolve. You don't necessarily have to wait that long. All of it doesn't need to dissolve to actually properly pickle the system. But if you just start circulating it immediately, there's going to be a lot of the pickling compound just floating around. It's nothing to really be concerned about. It'll still pickle the system just fine. But if you wait for a little while longer, it'll all dissolve. Critical step to this whole process is you want to be sure the pressure relief valve is open 1 full turn. So that's a half, that's a full turn. That way no pressure builds up on here. If the pressure gauge goes over about 30 psi when there's chemicals present, you can damage the membrane. Then at this point, you've got water in the bucket, fresh water in the bucket that's unchlorinated, the SC1 pickling compound in the bucket. Literally all you do then is just turn the power on, circulate the water through the system. The water is going to go out of the bucket, through the water maker, back into the bucket. You want that to circulate for about 20 minutes, and then you're done. And then when you're finished, you can literally just pull everything out, leave the pressure relief valve open, disconnect everything, drain as much out of the hoses as you can, and you can pack it up and you're ready to go.
Membrane replacements. It's very typical with seawater reverse osmosis to need to replace membranes regularly. With the aquifer system, however, you will not need to replace membranes during your deployment. You can expect 8 to 10 years of membrane life from your aquifer membranes.
Our systems are very easy on the membranes. We have systems that are over 20 years old that have the original membranes in them and they're still working fine. Now, we don't expect every system's membranes to last that long, but that just gives you an indication of how easy the Clark pump is on a membrane in a system like this. And we've deployed thousands, we've got literally 15,000 plus customers worldwide with this same system, and membrane replacements are actually very few and far between. In fact, when people buy one of our systems, one of the things they always want to do is, can I buy some spare membranes so I have them? And we always try to talk them out of it because it's really not necessary.
So one thing that we're looking for as aquifer operators is we want to remove any kinks in our lines. The kinks constrain the system, they reduce productivity, and they alter the pressures in the system. So we're always trying to find ways to remove any kinks. So let's talk quickly about resetting a quick connect fixture. These fixtures are designed to be set and reset by hand. The way this works is that there's a ring located at the entrance to the fixture. We hold that ring inward and then we can reset the hose. Once the hose is in all the way, it will not release. If you need to release one, hold the fixture inward and pull the hose out. In seawater reverse osmosis, the pressure in the system will vary according to the temperature and the salinity of the source water. It's typical to need to adjust your system for those pressures. In the case of the aquifer, there are no adjustments to be made. Our operators do not need to learn to monitor pressures and adjust them. The system will do that automatically.
Our systems don't have a pressure regulating valve. There's no operator adjustments to adjust feed pressure or membrane pressure. The membrane pressure is basically dictated by the membrane itself and the energy recovery system that we've built into the aquifer line. So there's no operator adjustments. There's no way for the operator to increase the membrane pressure and damage it. And that's one of the reasons our membranes last so long, because there's no adjustment. What that does, from a technical perspective, is it allows the water maker to run at the lowest possible membrane pressure. And that's really the secret sauce of why our systems work so well and the membranes last so long. Let's talk briefly about membrane cleaning. The process is identical to pickling as far as how everything's set up. The only difference is you're going to use a different chemical and you're going to let it sit for a while to actually allow the chemical to do its job. There's two reasons to clean. One is if the feed pressure starts to increase more than 15 or 20%. So if the high pressure that you see on the pressure gauge is normally 80 to 90 and that jumps up over time up to 110 or so, that may indicate that you need to clean. The other indicator is if There's an odor, a sulfur smell in the product water, and there's no smell in the feed water. That means you have bacteria growth going on in the membrane, and that's easily cleaned with SE2. It's possible that the membrane could scale in certain water chemistries. It's very rare, but it's possible. And in that case, you would want to use the SE3, which is an acidic cleaner. The SE2 is an alkaline cleaner. So typically, if you've got a situation where you think there's scaling, which would be indicated by, again, very high membrane pressure, and potentially a little bit reduced product production, then you would start with the SE3, which is the acidic cleaner, and then follow up with the SE2, which is an alkaline cleaner to normalize the pH in the membrane. Membrane cleaning is actually pretty rare. Really, the times that it happens is when people forget to pickle the system, or don't flush it properly, or they're in a hurry and they leave and then they forget that they didn't pickle the water maker, and it's a month later and now it's stinky. But it's really not any more complicated than that. Cleaning's nothing to be afraid of. It won't hurt the membrane if you follow the instructions. The chemicals that we use are designed specifically for our water makers. So be sure to only use our cleaning chemicals, because our water makers are made of engineering plastics, and we have a specific chemical mix that's designed for use with those plastics.